Sorry, I'm just not entirely here. I wanted to tell you that the winner of this year's Giller Prize was Anne Michaels for her book Held, which I hope was in the bookstore as well. She was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and Anne had previous commitments, so she wasn't able to come down this time to San Miguel, but we really hope to have her here soon. And in the meantime, I just finished reading Held, and I highly, highly recommend this deeply moving and absolutely original novel of love and loyalty and war and its dislocations, not only of place, but also of the soul. So at the same time, they're both small books, right? And you have room in your backpacks. I hope you will also, I hope you're also taking home a copy of Peacocks of Instagram, because it's already sold out of the bookstore. And it was one of the 4 shortlisted books for the 2024 Giller Prize. So I am really, really excited this afternoon to speak with the debut author of Peacocks of Instagram, Deepa Rajagopalan. Deepa was born in Saudi Arabia, moved to India as an adolescent, and in her 20s moved to the United States and Canada, where she's lived in a bunch of different cities, a peripatetic beginning that figures very large in her wonderful stories. Peacocks of Instagram is Deepa's first book. But over the past few years, while earning her MFA in creative writing at the University of Guelph, her stories have appeared in some of Canada's best literary magazines, including Room, the Ballahat Review, the New Quarterly, and also in the 2023 Bristol Short Story Prize Anthology in England. In 2021, so that was 4 years ago, she won the RBC PEN Canada New Voices Award for the title story, Peacocks of Instagram, which we're going to be talking about, fabulous story. And in 2024, the book was named an Apple Books Best Book of the Year. And in their commendation, they wrote, Rajagopalan communicates so much with so few words. She's one of the most gifted short story one of the most gifted short story authors we've encountered. So please join me in welcoming the very gifted Deepa Rajagopalan. Isn't it great? We coordinated the color of our clothes, but we're both very floral.
And I'm matching the logo.
You match the logo, and I match the eucalyptus. Thank you. That's what I wanted. So, Deepa, we're going to have a conversation about your book. You were trained as an engineer, is that right?
Yes.
And you still work as in the engineering tech field?
Yeah, I still have my tech job.
Okay, you're going to have to hold this because...
Is that better? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. So do you want to repeat that?
I still have my tech job. Yeah, I do work in tech still.
So I'm curious, what drew you to writing?
Yeah, like you said, I was born in Saudi Arabia in a small town called Hafr al-Batin that nobody had heard of. My parents used to work there, and it was a very sheltered life. We were like in this small migrant community. It was a boring place, so I read a lot I started reading when I was 3, and I used to read a lot. I didn't have access to a lot of books, but I would read whatever I could get my hands on. I remember reading a grammar and composition book for fun. I would read recipe books for fun. I wasn't cooking or anything, I just wanted to read. And nobody was watching what we were reading those days, so I would read beyond my age. I read The Godfather when I was like 8 years old and didn't understand much. And I distinctly remember when I was 8, I read Great Expectations, and it occurred to me that books had authors, and that I could write one. And I was a very enterprising, resourceful, ambitious child, and I thought, okay, if Dickens could write it, I can write one. And I started writing a novel when I was 8 years old. It was heavily plagiarized from the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It had a female protagonist, though everybody in the book had sort of blonde hair and blue eyes, because I didn't have the imagination then to write, different from what I was reading. But yeah, I was really into books. Spoiler alert: that book didn't go anywhere. But I continued to write. I was always writing for like school magazines and newspapers and like the children's section of the newspapers. And I think it was only, and when I was 12 years old, I went to India. I went to boarding school in India. And I think it was when I was 14 was when I was first exposed to a book by a non-Western author. And that book was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. It just blew my mind away. I felt like she wrote that book for me. I was just amazed by the familiarity of the people, the place, and this very specific angst of being a Malayali. I come from a state called Kerala in India, and I just felt, oh, this is how it feels to read something written by someone who looks like you and feel represented. So that book hugely influenced me. But as I grew up, and we didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have the luxury then to go into the arts. So I did get an engineering degree. I needed to be able to sustain myself. And then I moved to the United States, and I moved to Canada after that. And after a few years, I realized there was a void in my life because I wasn't writing as much as I wanted to. So I decided to take it more seriously. I went back to school. I did an MFA, and that's how I got back to writing. Yeah.
Well, and I have to just say, for those of you who haven't seen this beautiful young woman wandering around with her mother, Hannah is also a voracious reader. Every time I see her, she's reading a different book. And it's not because she's putting them away halfway through. She's devouring the whole thing. So maybe there's going to be a family writing thing. Before we go on, can you summarize this book in a few words?
Okay, I'll try.
Isn't it beautiful?
So the book is called Peacocks of Instagram. It is a collection of short stories. It is about Indian women who kind of shuttle between India and the US and Canada. It examines structures of privilege and misogyny. And there's different kinds of characters. Some of the characters look like me, have a similar background as me, and some of them don't. But in some way or the other, all of them are trying to answer this question: in what ways do we take power when power is withheld?
That's a great introduction, because what I felt when I read this book, there's a tremendous restlessness in it, and I found that really intriguing. I mean, the characters themselves are restless. They're figuring out their identities. They're, am I Indian? Am I Canadian? Am I American? And in many stories, they're going back and forth between India and Canada or the United States, between their birthplace and their adopted homes, and never sure where they belong. So place and connection to place is a strong... Oh, you want me to do this? Okay. They should make them otherwise, because this feels just a little otherwise. I won't use the word. Yes, so place and the connection to place is one of the real underlying themes, right? So does this come, and I'm sure it's both, but can you say if it comes mostly from your own experience, from your own heart and your own movements, Or does it come from observing the other people in your communities?
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that question, and especially the use of the word restlessness. I think I have never felt like I belong somewhere, and I don't mean that in a tragic way. I think feeling like an outsider has only been advantageous as a writer. I feel like I'm always kind of observing. I feel like I'm observing myself and also the people around me, so that has helped in the writing of the book. Like me, I think most of the characters in this book and also in the novel I'm writing right now have a very kind of fluid sense of belonging, right? Their idea of home is rather slippery. I think they tend to make home where they are, right? So I have this distinct memory when I was 8 years old. A lot of things happen when I'm 8. When I was 8 years old, I went to India with my parents and my little sister on summer vacation we lived in, my grandparents lived in Kerala, which is in the southern part of India. And we were visiting my aunt, my mother's sister and her family in Jamshedpur, which is more northeast. And we didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't fly. We took a train, and it was a 3-day train trip. And I remember it was a first-class compartment, so it had a door and bunk beds and like a table. So every morning, my mother, in the 3 days, my mother would set a little vase with a few fake flowers. And in the evening, at 6 p.m., she would make a little altar with a flower and a statue of Lord Ganesh, and we would pray around it. And I still remember very vividly thinking, oh, this is home. This is all you need for home, of fake flowers, a vase, and an altar and people who you love and who love you. So that's my relationship with home. And I think that's what you'll find in the book too. Like place as a placeholder for belonging is not something that you'll find in the book. I think it's more home is more like where you are. You tend to make home where you are. That's my relationship with it.
Well, and I think that I certainly am thinking of the people who live here half-time or full-time. It's very similar. It's a chosen home rather than, a birth home. That sense of restlessness is really enhanced in the book because characters appear and reappear in different stories. There might be a story that's completely about one character, and then they'll pop up as a cameo in 3 other stories. And that made me feel like the whole book was a community, that you were really writing not just about individuals, but about a community. So I'm wondering how that evolved, if that was in your mind when you began the collection, or is this something that arose as you were writing various stories?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I was writing the collection, I initially had about 10 stories, and then I wrote 4 more stories. But I did notice the same characters were kind of showing up in other stories. And at first, I removed that because I was like, I'm writing a short story collection. It's not a novel. It's not a linked collection either. So I removed those links, and I made them individual stories. And then after I kind of assembled them together, I missed it. I missed that sense of community. I missed, it was like I was hiding some things from the reader. So I went back and put those links back. But they were quite subtle in the beginning. And my editor was like, why is it so subtle? And I was like, I just want like the really careful reader to get it. And she's like, you should probably make them more obvious. So I went back and made those links more obvious. So you'll find a story about a little girl in boarding school, and then in another story, she's older and she's in the U.S. and she's working in the U.S. And in another story, she's the friend of somebody else. So you'll find those links and also links to place, which I really love when I see that in stories, and I wanted the reader to have that experience. Yeah.
Well, and I think I'm glad you didn't make it any more obvious than it is, because I find these links quite subtle still. You kind of happen upon somebody as if you've seen them in the grocery store and think, weren't you in the other story? I love it. I love it. And the other thing I like, and this is a very, very subtle collective piece of writing. One of the things I love about your style is that there are deep insights that appear almost as throwaway lines. And it's especially evident for me in the story Driving Lessons. Could you read us a bit from the beginning of that story? We're going to have little readings throughout. I hope that's okay with everybody.
So this story is called Driving Lessons. This is about that girl I was telling you about who was in boarding school and now she has just moved to California for her job. Driving Lessons. Here in our office lunchroom, I have made friends. Now, there are two kinds of Indians who move to the US. One who transforms drastically in their appearance, in their manner of speaking, in their preferences, and the other who fiercely remains the same. Pinky was in the former category. After living in the US for over 10 years, she dressed like an American, spoke with an almost American accent, and was concerned with things like jamba juice running out of wheatgrass. She was light-skinned for an Indian and bleached her hair. She had expensive nails, the clear, glossy ones with white tips. She said with pride that people often mistook her for a white person. While a part of me judged her for concealing her Indianness, for being enamored with everything American, another part of me wondered how it would feel to transform like that, turn into a new person. Bhanu, however, spoke with a distinct Telugu accent, never pronouncing things in a way that would make it easier for an American to understand. Wore her hair in a braid and did not try to hide the thick gold and black Mangalsutra around her neck, the marker of a married Hindu woman. I didn't want to be either of them. Besides, I was only here temporarily for a work project, unlike the two of them. Pinky, who had made America her home, and Bhanu, who seemed like she was on that path. But did I want to go back to Hyderabad and share a 2-bedroom apartment with 5 girls?
So, thank you. This story, and in fact the whole collection, explores different ways of being an immigrant, as that passage shows. But that's something that I think many of us can also identify with, assimilate or hang on to the culture of your birth. And that takes a lot of different forms. The stories are about power, not just the power of privilege or class or race or gender, but power in unexpected situations with unexpected characters, which gives the stories a kind of universality, which I found very refreshing. So what is your fascination with power?
Yeah, I think like you said, like I said earlier, I've been quite obsessed with that idea of who has power, who doesn't have power, and when you don't have it, what do you do with it, right? So you'll find characters who navigate that in different ways in the book. There are some characters who are kind of quiet and don't really have any agency to do much about them not having power. And there's a story called Cake in this, which is about a housekeeper who's disadvantaged in many ways. And she's really good at her job and she's looking for a promotion, but she's just not getting it. It's being given to men who are less qualified and less talented and less deserving than her. And she tries to do all the things the right way. She does all these courses. She's excellent at her job. And yet she doesn't get it because that's just where she falls in society. But her way of taking power is, she eventually takes the silent revenge that only this one other person knows what she did. But that's because that's the only agency she has, right? While other characters, there's another story called The Many Homes of Kanmani, which I'll probably read from later. It's about a young child who loses her parents to a climate change-related tragedy, and she goes through the foster care system, and she has no power. Like, she is a child, and she's in the foster care system, and she keeps moving homes, but she also takes power in a way that is unexpected and kind of also somewhat revengeful. So it's just, I think I'm just kind of observant of how people navigate not having power and what they do with it and how they still come out triumphant on the other side.
As a reader, I found that there was a lot of trickery involved in how, especially women, were subverting the system and getting what they wanted. And I found that the way you did that made me just be cheering for these people, right? These characters, right? Hoping that they got what they were looking for. There are a lot of plot twists in, I think, in most stories. And it's the plot twist that gives the stories a real depth. And I'm thinking, in particular, of the title story, which is Peacocks of Instagram, which is really, truly brilliant. The story starts out to be about earrings made of peacock feathers, and then goes to a much deeper, darker place. And I wondered if you can read a bit from that story. If you want to set it up, it might need some setup.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this story is about a woman, a middle-aged woman, who on the surface looks like somebody that you would know, looks like a very ordinary immigrant person who is a coffee shop employee. But I really wanted to subvert the reader's expectations of this character and characters like her that you encounter in your life. She's had a very traumatic past, but she's built a beautiful life for herself, and she knows that she's not ordinary. And through the span of the story, you slowly come to understand what that past is, and what makes her extraordinary and what makes her life extraordinary. So I'll just read from a little bit. I'm reading from about the middle of the story. The problem with blocking out a time of your life is that you cannot be selective. You have to give up the good with the bad, even the mundane. The songs my father used to sing, the color of my mother's eyes, the curl in my sister's pigtails, all the little things. Sometimes I try to remember the words of the prayer my mother used to say when she lit the evening lamp by the sacred tulsi plant, or the way we caught fireflies under the massive peepal tree outside our little house. But when I slept, I would inevitably end up in this nightmare. I'm standing on a step stool under wooden gallows. A noose slips over my head and the step stool disappears. I'm suspended in the air. I hear my father say, "Don't fight it." I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So now she's off work. She was working at the coffee store, and she had met somebody who came to buy coffee who was protesting these laws against farmers in India. So she meets him when she's walking out. So she's having a conversation with him. My father had given up believing our lives would ever get better. I was almost 17 when he sat me down to tell me his plan. He said, if the four of us, the entire family, gave up our lives, that would send a message the government couldn't ignore. I didn't think he would actually go through with it. A snowplow was spraying salt on the street in front of the mall. I couldn't have gone on, but my story had started and wouldn't stop. My father's face had turned gray. His lungi was flapping in the wind. My mother's sari had come undone, and she looked so skinny with her midriff exposed. I couldn't bring myself to look at my sister's face, but I remember she was wearing a red dress that used to be mine. I don't know how they forced the noose around her neck. I don't know if my father did it or my mother. It was a jute rope. They must have been itchy on her, I said. One of the neighbors helped me bring their bodies down. At the temple, the priest who came to do the puja for the funeral lit an entire pack of sandalwood agarbattis and a coconut oil lamp before the bodies were taken to the crematorium. The whole place smoked and stank of burning.
The voice in all these stories is really refreshingly unsentimental and non-judgmental. You don't tell us what we're supposed to be thinking about these characters, their predicaments, or how they solve them. You leave the reader to make up their own minds about what's going on. How intentional was that, or is that part of your character or your approach to life? Or is this something that you were intentionally wanting to do in these stories?
Yeah, no, it was very intentional. I think that was one of the first things when I started writing, fiction that I really wanted to do. Because most of the writers that I admire, that's what they do, like Murakami or Katsuo Ishiguro, or even Suvankam Tamavongsa. I think it's very important not to judge our characters. It's very important not to, as writers, not to present our opinions about our characters. Like, that's the job of the reader. Our job is to present and really know them deeply, know our characters deeply, but to present them as they are and leave it to the reader to form opinions about them, to kind of form their own opinions and which characters they relate to. That really depends on the reader. So that was very intentional, yeah.
Well, that's good to know. But a lot of writers don't come to that until they're much further along in their careers. They, make these. It's a very common error, I find, with beginning writers. Did anybody help you with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of reading during the MFA. When I did my MFA, I had some wonderful mentors. Suvankam Tamavongsa was and still a mentor and friend, and I did learn a lot from her style of writing, and also just by reading different authors. So I love to read. I feel like you can do an MFA in short stories just by reading Alice Munro and Raymond Carver and Hemingway. I think it's a wonderful opportunity that we have to look at writers you admire and see what they've done technically. Like, I read an Alice Munro story and it's like you spanned so many decades in like 20 pages, and and then there's all these plot twists. Like, how did she do it? So I do go through that very technically and see, okay, what did she do in this paragraph? How did she span like 10 years? And kind of learn from reading other authors. Yeah.
It's reading like a writer, right?
Yeah. I can only read writer now.
Exactly. Well, and that can be a bit debilitating sometimes when you want to just read for fun. There's a lot of humor in this book. The characters are resilient, but they're not earnest. They often get ahead by a kind of trickery, which is, you read in that one story. One of the stories that I love, so Peacocks of Instagram is the opening story. The closing story is bestsellers, which also has a kind of a, does she sell those things on Instagram?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so Instagram comes in at the end too. So it's this woman whose husband has left her, and she takes up ceramics, and she makes these very rough and rugged ceramics of, one of them is called Honey, It's For You, and it's a woman holding out a telephone, and I won't do your story justice, I'm sorry, because I can't quote it, but so then she writes a story with each of the things that she posts on Instagram for sale, and in the story she says her husband never liked affectionate terms, wouldn't let her call him honey or sweetie or, pumpkin or whatever we call each other. And so she called her ex-husband at one point, and his new wife answered the phone with, "Honey, it's for you." But it's that whole story, I just love it. It's so funny and it's so true. And I want somebody to start making those ceramics and selling them with these amazing stories, because I think whoever did that would do really well. But you're going to read from a story called The Many Houses of... Yeah.
So this story is about, this foster child who's lost her parents to climate change-related tragedy. So I'm going to read from like somewhere in the beginning of the story and skip ahead to the end, because that usually makes people want to read the book. The Many Homes of Kanmani. There's a spot on the highway where the road dips. My mother and I used to pretend it was a roller coaster and scream with glee when we drove over it. English escaped my mother, always running away, running in circles. She had a degree in Tamil literature, and speaking Tamil is like making honey. In the 10 years my mother was in the US, no one would give her a job because they couldn't understand what she was saying. But my mother was full of meaning, and the people she came across became full of knowing for having met her. She could get to the point quickly because she knew only a few words. But that wasn't the kind of language people who were hiring were looking for. My father was a truck driver, which was like having a father only on paper. He was gone for days, sometimes weeks at a time. My mother insisted that I go to a Montessori school, the kind where each child is supposed to learn at their own pace. Looking back, I realized this was probably why my father had to work so hard. The school was in another neighborhood, a half-hour drive away. I was the only daughter of a truck driver amid the kids of lawyers, dentists, realtors, and engineers. I know this because the teachers assigned us a project in which we had to write what our parents did for a living. Mrs. Aaron told me to write stay-at-home mom as my mother's profession and trucker as my father's. Corey, who was also 8 but still reading at a grade 1 level, read my father's profession as fucker, which the kids found hilarious. When I told my mother about this at pickup, she had to look up the word on her phone. She said, "Good, we have a new word for F for the word game." And we laughed louder than necessary. She kissed me on both cheeks right there in the parking lot. Unlike other moms, her love was always out in the open for everyone to see. Her love was also full of Tamil. She used to call me Kanmani, precious, the apple of her eye. I've forgotten most of the Tamil I used to know, but sometimes in a crowded place, I'll hear some family talking Tamil, and the words will come back to me along with my mother, unharmed. I'm just going to read the last paragraph. I hid the cocaine under the seat in the father's shiny blue car and called the cops from a payphone. They would never suspect a 14-year-old foster child. Like clockwork, they arrived and arrested him. I put on a good show of crying an appropriate amount. He sure didn't pitch anything to anyone, and the story, along with the name of his company, was all over the news. Soon after this, the mother sent me back. I'm in my 4th home this year, an apartment the size of the last family's living room, back in the old, hot, cramped neighborhood I used to live in with my parents. It has been raining for 3 days straight, outside the window, in the alleyways, on the streets. This city wasn't built for this type of rain, my mother used to say. The president will need to give a speech soon. Cars are stranded in rising water like floating hippopotamus heads. A group of people wade through the waist-high water, their torsos swinging side to side. It occurs to me that, like everyone else, I have only one home.
So why short stories?
I think the short story form comes naturally to me. I think as a person, I'm quite brief and like to in and out quickly. I just like to be articulate. So it comes more naturally. Also, I am very uncomfortable with the first draft phase. So in a short story, it's like a couple of weeks. When you're writing a novel, it takes takes months and months to finish a first draft. And I just have this tendency to start revising and editing, and looking at the language and making the language make sense to me. So I think that's why I'm just naturally inclined to the short story. And also it helped that, you know, when I did an MFA, it was easier to write short stories.
So what are the challenges of it for you?
Of the short story?
Yeah, what things are most difficult in the short story for you?
I think when you're writing a short story, there's 14 stories in it and probably about 10 different characters, main characters. I think we need to know everything about the 10 characters as if you were writing a novel, but you don't put it in the text. You need to know it so it comes through in the text. So in that way, it's challenging in the sense you really need to know everything about them, who they are, what they would do in a situation that's not in the book. And then you need to really be so efficient with your language and be, so like I feel like it helps, it's kind of adjacent to poetry in the sense that you have to be very specific with the words that you're using. You don't have any spare words. I took a poetry class with Dion Brand, Canadian poet Dion Brand, and we were workshopping, and she said, "Deepa, do you really need this word here?" And I was like, "No, I don't need this word here." So it really helped me when I'm writing short stories to think about having the exact word with the exact meaning, and that's such a sense of gratification when you get that, but it is challenging.
Well, you do it really well, and yet you are working on a novel now. So why? Looking for a new challenge?
Well, I was working on the novel before I started writing the short story collection, and then I fell in love with the short story form, and I went that way. So now I've returned to the novel, and also, like, when my agent was trying to sell this book, a lot of publishers said, "We love her voice, we love her writing, come back to us when you have a novel." So I'm just waiting to go back with a novel. Yeah, it is a challenge. For me, it's a lot more challenging than a short story collection.
Well, and that's true. I mean, it's for as long as I've been writing, which is probably too long, 40-some years, publishers always say, we can't sell short stories. But I want to know, how many people here read short stories? You see? Ooh. You see? We all read short stories. Like, how is it that they can't sell collections of short stories? Or is it just, you know, something in their head so they don't buy them and therefore they can't sell them? I find it very peculiar because short stories are among my favorite form of reading, partly because if I'm reading at night, I can actually finish it, like everybody else. So, you know, you have been a finalist for an extraordinary prize. It's the second largest purse in North America for a literary work. So it's really big. The largest one, by the way, is the Carol Shields Prize. So has this changed your life in any way?
Yeah, I mean...
Or has it not changed your life in any way?
Yeah, like I like to say, a year ago I was just a software engineer with a big dream. Now I'm here in this wonderful San Miguel Literary Festival. It is absolutely changed my life, right? I think there are a lot of good books, a lot of good short story collections, but many of them don't see the light of day, don't reach the readers who actually will enjoy those books because of the way the economics of publishing works. So this has been extremely, extremely life-changing for me. And right from the PEN Canada Award, like that also opened a lot of doors for me. That's how I found my agent and my publisher. But this has been extremely life-changing. I've had the opportunity to go to a lot of festivals, you know, meet, and I mean, just here right now, like I'm staying with this lovely couple, Sari and Abe, in their beautiful home here, and now I think they've become lifelong friends. Absolutely wonderful. And when I came here, you know, we were just talking about how big the festival is, and many of the speakers here have been, you know, writing for longer than I've been alive, and they're legends. And to be on this stage, it's an incredible honor. And Sari said, "This is really important. Don't fuck this up." So that was my goal. so I hope I didn't.
No, not for a second, not for a second. There is such a thing as, the sophomore block, right? For writers who come out with a really fantastic book the first time, it can make it difficult, depending on who you are, to write that second book. Because it's a novel, it will definitely get placed. But is the success of this riding on your shoulder at all while you're working on the novel?
No, not really. I honestly don't have the time to think about that much. I really love writing. I really enjoy the process of writing. And I'm absolutely enjoying my novel. I have daily deadlines. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. I write for a couple of hours, and I'm just really enjoying the process. And I know that if I write a good book, hopefully it'll find its readers. I'm not thinking about anything beyond that at this point. I do think that being shortlisted for the Giller Prize will give me more opportunities for that novel to reach more people than if I hadn't. So I'm optimistic about it, but I'm not really thinking anything beyond that. Yeah.
Has it sold in India?
This book? No, not yet. Yeah, it is available in India, but it ships from...
In English?
In English, yes. It's not translated, not yet.
We have the same agent. I know a little bit about her. So I think there are quite a few workshop attendees here. How many people here have been attending the workshops? Yeah, quite a few of you. So you were writing long before you decided to take an MFA. But could you talk about and actually you did two things. You did a certificate of creative writing from the University of Toronto, and then you did a master's of creative writing at the University of Guelph. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that, or if you could have done what you've done without it, or, for the benefit of people who might be considering doing that?
Yeah. No, I think it was extremely beneficial for me. I really wanted to do this. I wanted to improve my craft, but I also wanted a community of writers, to be surrounded by writers, and especially the MFA to have those 2 years to just focus on one thing and, without distractions. It was quite life-changing for me, and I met so many mentors who really helped me, were very generous. Suvankam Tamavangsa being most important mentor. She was very generous with her time. She was, not just for craft, but also about publishing. She's told me more about publishing than, most people would tell you. And also, I think the whole idea of, being a writer and feeling like a writer, it helps to be in that community, right? And I, of course, learned a lot about craft, took a lot of workshops, and it really helped find my way, and to, have this book out, a year after, or have a contract a year after the MFA, which was incredible. Yeah.
Wow, congratulations. And you mentioned mentors. And I know that Suvanka has been a tremendous mentor for you. I don't know how many of you saw my conversation with her. That Suvanka won the Giller during COVID, so we did a Zoom event rather than an in-person event. Are there models in literature that were important to you as well as mentors? I know Pasha Mala was another mentor of yours. Again, he's a Canadian writer, fantastic writer who hasn't had the acclaim, I think, that he deserves. But are there mentors, sort of private mentors in literature that were significant to you?
Yeah, I think Suvankam has been, she was my mentor during my MFA, but that was, a few years ago, and she's continued to remain one and a good friend of mine. I think what's important is like finding somebody who gets your writing and who you have a rapport with, right? Like what I loved about Suvankam was she didn't try to curb my ambition, right? Like she was ambitious for me, which a lot of times you don't find, right? In a lot of these creative writing classes, I find professors or instructors who tell you, oh, it's going to take you years to write a book. It's going to take you and it might be true, but I think it's helpful to have somebody who you know has your back and understands what you're trying to do. And I like it when their feedback, and that's how I gauge whether I trust somebody's feedback, when that feedback is expansive and not prescriptive, right? And not to say do this or don't do this, but what if you could do this, right? Or Suvankam would just say, you can do more. You can do more here. And I was like, yes, I can do more here. You know, and that was enough for me. And I think that's the kind of mentorship that works for me. Whereas, you know, some other mentors might be like, or even, you know, in writing groups, we are all in writing groups. And sometimes the feedback is kind of not helpful. Right? It'll be like, oh, you should never put a dream sequence in a book. I'm like, why? Like, why can't we put a dream sequence in a book? Like, I like more feedback that's more expansive, and that's kind of how I look for mentors, yeah.
That's great. Well, I see the audience question mic is coming out. If you had an advice to a young writer, perhaps someone younger, even younger than yourself, someone, you know, maybe in high school who's writing away with stories, what would you tell them?
I actually wrote down something, a quote from Dion Brand that I want to read. It's about poetry, but it could apply to any writing. It says, the best poetry jolts and shocks. It mines language for what we've not seen, have not heard. I think that's beautiful. I think stories have been told for centuries, right? Like there's really nothing new that you can say. I have a lot of younger writers, and even in the last couple of days, people have said, I want to write, but I don't know what's special about my story. And the truth is, there probably isn't anything special about the story, but we have language, right? We have language to say it in a way that it hasn't been said before, that only we can say because of our perspective and our experiences. And I think that's a beautiful time, and that's why we should all keep writing.
That's perfect. Okay, time to turn the conversation over to the audience. Anybody has a question, please come up.
Thank you so much, Deepa. I actually have a question.
Wow, hi, Jody.
Hi. You talk a lot about power. So I'm curious as to how do you take power and how do you use writing to take power as a woman of color in the world that's, you know, often white male dominated?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think I've had a lot of trouble with that, but as I've grown older, I've kind of figured out what makes sense to me, what ways of taking power make sense to me, what kinds of rebellion work for me. And for me, it's always using words, right? Like that's the only way I know how to take power. And you know, it's going to show up in my work. It's going to show up in my characters. And I do find as in my life, if I, find somebody more disadvantaged, like I do find that tendency to kind of protect them and be protective about them. And if I have the power to give them a stage or give them an opportunity to do that. And as I'm growing older, I feel like I'm doing more and more of that. And I think, that's in this book, you'll find what I wanted to do with this book, Peacocks on Instagram, is to refuse stereotypical narratives about the immigrant person, the immigrant woman specifically, right? Like it's, and the way I try to do that is by presenting the stereotypical version of them, like the housekeeper or coffee shop employee or, somebody who just sells ceramics on social media, and then really subvert their expectations of them, right? Really get the reader to know them in a different light. And if you are a person of color, you will hopefully feel seen and understood. And if you're not, then you hopefully will take something away from that, right? That was what I tried to do with this book, yeah.
Hi, I just started your book, so I covered my ears with your reading of the first story because I'm in the middle of it. Don't want to know the plot twist. There was a French writer named Irène Nemirovsky. Unfortunately, her life was cut short by the Nazis. But she wrote short stories and novels, and she wanted to get to know her characters very, very well, like you are telling us. And she would actually create biographies, write them down, even though they might not be included in her book. So I'm very curious. You said it's very important to know your characters very well. How do you get to know your characters?
What's your name?
Nadine.
Nadine. Hi, Nadine. Thank you.
I also have an Indian name, Nandini. I have
Nan-
2 names, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Nadine, Nandini. Yeah, I think I try to do that. Before I start writing, I let the story and the character. A story usually comes to me in the form of a character, and I'm usually kind of thinking about the character before I think about the story or the plot. And I spend some time letting that marinate. I go on long walks. I let the idea marinate, let the character marinate. And then I just start writing. A lot of times I write backstories. And I know that I'm not going to put it into the story, but I'll just keep writing until I know where they're from, what kind of food do they like, what do they hate, what are their obsessions, what are their passions, what are their desires. And I actually write it in the story, and then I take it away, right? And because I've written it and because I know it kind of shows up in the story. I sometimes would only need one sentence, or the way they respond to somebody, or the way they show up, for someone else. All of that comes through because I've done that work. And that's what I try to do, yeah.
Wow, thank you. Very interesting.
Thanks, Nadine.
And I could just add that there are character prompts online. If you just look in character prompts, there are sheets that go through all the things you need to know about the characters, and I find them really useful for, expanding that. And I often write letters from the character to me, right? So that you can catch the character's voice separate from yourself. Yeah.
Deepa, Suleiman, I wondered what my question for you would be, because I've had some wonderful fun asking questions of your peers. You're so disciplined, and you're so amazingly detached as well, and very insightful. And your main métier has been short story, and now the shift to the novel. Do you feel yourself changing in any way? I mean, your observations are so sharp in the short story format, the discrete format. But do you feel something changing and shifting for you now you're moving into the novel métier?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suleiman. Yeah, I think the way I write, I find that changing a little bit. Like I said earlier, I like to kind of write down what I think the story should be and then take it out, right? And for a short story, it's easy to do because you end up with like 10 to 20 pages for a short story. But for a novel, it's quite different. I'm trying to get used to meandering. I'm trying to get used to not just focusing on like the main character and maybe another character, but going into rabbit holes and going into backstories that I wouldn't normally do in a short story. And I'm trying to get more comfortable with just being, just being there and not being afraid of, is this rabbit hole going to lead to anything, right? So I do think that my style of writing is changing. In some ways, it's slowing down a little bit. My novel it's told from a place of memory, so it's a nostalgic novel. I'm very inspired by one of my favorite books of all time, Norwegian Wood by Murakami. And it's very interesting because that book is probably the only realistic novel that Murakami has written that doesn't have a cat that talks, or a person noticing that, why is this cat talking, right? Like, and I find my fiction is quite realistic, and I love writing from that place of memory. So the novel kind of follows the lives of these 3 characters and spans like about 3 decades and goes from Saudi Arabia to India to the US. Their lives are intertwined because of a tragedy that happened during the Gulf War in Saudi Arabia. And only one character really knows what happens, and the other 2 kind of spend their lives trying to figure out what happened. And it's been very interesting writing from that place of nostalgia. So yeah, that's what it's about.
Nice. I really appreciated what you said about feedback and people getting it. Can you speak any more about the relationship with the editor? And because it feels to me like it's a really important, in my life, important part, the feedback that I get from other people, but especially an editor. And yet sometimes it feels like it's not the right feedback, and yet I want to honor their perspective. How do you tell what's right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I get asked that a lot. Like during my MFA and in other writing groups I've seen writers receiving a lot of feedback, and they're all very varied feedback because people are different. And sometimes some writers take all of the feedback, and then it becomes like this Frankenstein piece that doesn't make any sense and is not their voice anymore. Surprisingly, I've never had a problem with that. Like, I just don't take the feedback that I don't think works for my story. And if it's a writing group, I respectfully just don't take the feedback. But if it's coming from my editor, I would say, I love my editor. She's wonderful, Shira Rose-Wilinski. I probably took about 50% of her feedback, right? And I respectfully went through everything else and explained why I didn't want to take the feedback. And she was always very generous and said, take what you need to. But I would, things like, there's a lot of, the book is mostly about South Asians, and there's a lot of cultural words and phrases in the book. And there's a lot of humor that's also very cultural in the book that sometimes my editor would be like, maybe you want to explain this, or maybe you want to explain this a little bit more. And I didn't want to. Growing up, until I said earlier, until I was 14, I only read Western authors. And I had to look up everything. And it was quite enjoyable for me. I felt like I could be somewhere I wasn't, or in a century that I wasn't in, by just, learning and looking up things. And I wanted that experience, and I didn't want to cater to any gaze. So I've never had a problem, because I'm just thinking about the end result, right? I just want every feedback to be in service to the story, because that's what is going to be useful for the reader. So yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
I would just add to that as I was about halfway through the first story, and I said to my husband, Wayne, I said, this isn't an MFA collection. Because in the back it said that she'd been to an MFA program, and honestly, you can almost tell, because they've taken such a grab bag of advice that there isn't a clear voice. And your voice is absolutely clear. These are clear that they're your stories, and the voice is authentic. So I'm really glad to hear what you said about, taking other people's feedback.
Hello, my name is Barry, and I heard you talk about Murakami as an author that interests you, and now you just referred to him again. So I was curious about how you use these other authors to inform your writing. What is the process? You gave us a little bit of it, but I'd like to hear a little more.
Yeah. I think I like to emulate authors. I find that during my MFA, there was this fiction course that I took where the professor, Michael Winter, basically just he gave us little pieces to read and asked us to copy that. And I was furious. I was like, I don't want to copy. But after you did it, it just felt completely different because you're writing it, right? It didn't feel like a copy of anything. And I think that's a great way to learn. You can emulate writers or things that they're doing. And if I'm writing something, I tend to read only in that style, right, of other authors who are writing in that style or similar things, so I can absorb that. So there's a story in this collection called Corey. It was sort of inspired by this Alice Munro story, Rahel. So, sorry, the other way around. My story is called Rahel. The Alice Munro story is called Corey. And it's about this married man having an affair with this woman, and in the end there's a betrayal, and the betrayal, like he betrays her. And the prompt that I gave myself is I wanted that to be the premise, but there's another betrayer where she betrays him back, and for it to be told from both the characters' perspectives. And that's what I did. And it was a completely different story because it was my story. Alice Munro's story doesn't leave Southern Ontario, as many of her stories don't. Mine is kind of all over the place. And it kind of weaves between these two characters' point of view. But I think it was such a good exercise to do that. And there's so much of wealth of information to be learned from reading these books. And, I kind of try to do it very technically.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Barry.
I think this is our last question.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the inspiration for the title. I've been reading a lot about enthusiastic reviewers on TikTok, so much that it's called book talk, because it's a whole phenomenon. And I haven't read the book, your book, but I will. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit about the inspiration for the title.
Yeah, so the title actually comes from the title story where this woman sells peacock accessories on Instagram, and her handle is Peacocks of Instagram. And that's where the title comes from. But I really kind of wanted to, there's a couple of stories, like the first story and the last story. The book is bookended by these women who are, not very privileged, don't have a lot of agency, but they sell things on Instagram. And, it's a facade, right? They're putting on a show. That's not the real them, and they know that. And, you call it your peacocking, right? So I kind of wanted to hint to that when I thought about the title. And also, it's a catchy title. I had a few agents, when I was querying, I had like few agents who wanted to read it because of the title, so.
It's an excellent title. Before we leave, I just want to encourage you that these books there are no books left here of the Peacocks of Instagram, but I hope you're all making a wonderful long list to take back to Canada or the United States with you, or if you live here in San Miguel, take to Aurora Books with you, and I'm sure she will be bringing in whatever books that you ask for. I hope you'll go to the panel after this at 4:30 to 5:30, and then to the Percival Everett / Margaret Atwood Wayne Grady conversation at 6:30. So thank you very much, very, very, very much, Deepa.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, the panel is at 4. It's from 4 to 5, right?
So if you are wanting your same seats for the 4 o'clock, please stay where you are, and the ushers, just get your tickets or your badges out, and the ushers will come and just confirm. Okay, thank you.
And if anybody wants Deepa's book signed, I'm sure she would be happy to do that from the stage.